It seems like everywhere you look these days, it's all about electric vehicles.
Yeah.
It's really incredible to see how fast things are moving, and I think it's pretty clear that EVs are going to be a huge part of our transportation future.
Oh, absolutely. I think, you can't really talk about the future of transportation without electric vehicles being right at the center of that conversation.
Right, and of course, if we're talking about EVs, we have to talk about the batteries.
The batteries, yeah.
The batteries are really the heart of it all. I mean, they're driving this whole revolution.
They really are. And it's a field that is just exploding right now with innovation. You see these breakthroughs happening all the time, and it's just going to completely reshape not just the car industry, but so many other industries as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that it goes so far beyond just cars, right?
Absolutely.
It's energy storage, it's technology, it's materials, science, it all comes together.
Yeah. And sustainability too, right? I mean, that's a huge piece of this whole conversation.
Absolutely. So that's what we're going to really try to unpack today. We've got some really fascinating information to dive into, and I'm excited to explore this whole world of EV batteries with you.
Yeah, me too. It's gonna be fun.
So to kind of set the stage, one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was looking at all this material you sent over is just how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about sort of incremental improvements to the battery itself, like making it a little bit better here or there.
Right.
It's really about the entire ecosystem. It's about the raw materials that go into these batteries. It's about what happens to them at the end of their life. It's about the technologies that are being developed to recycle them and how they can be used in new and different ways.
Yeah, exactly. It's a complete, life cycle that we're talking about here. And every single stage of it is undergoing some pretty dramatic shifts right now.
Yeah, and it's all happening at the same time, which is what makes it so fascinating and so complex.
Yeah, for sure. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is try to break down some of those key areas. We'll talk about how we can make these batteries more sustainable through recycling. We'll look at the different chemistries that are being developed to boost performance and reduce reliance on certain problematic materials.
Right.
And we'll even look at some of the I guess you could say system-level changes, like how these batteries can be integrated into the power grid or repurposed for different applications after their initial use in a vehicle.
Okay, so a lot to cover.
A lot to cover.
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
Let's start with something that I think really lays the groundwork for a lot of this conversation, and that's recycling.
Yeah.
It seems like recycling has gone from being sort of a nice thing to do to being absolutely essential.
Oh, it's essential. It's not even an option anymore.
Especially when we're talking about the scale of EV adoption that we're expecting to see in the coming years.
Right. I mean, just think about the sheer number of electric vehicles that are going to be on the roads in the next decade or two.
It's going to be huge. It's going to be massive. And all of those vehicles are going to need batteries. And those batteries are made from finite resources.
Right. And those resources are not exactly evenly distributed around the world.
That's a really important point. We're talking about materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel.
Yeah.
These are things that are concentrated in specific geographical locations, and that creates a whole set of challenges, both from a supply chain perspective and from an environmental perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really talk about sustainable transportation without thinking about where those materials are coming from and how they're being extracted.
Exactly. And that's where recycling becomes so crucial. It gives us a way to diversify our sources of these materials. It helps to reduce our dependence on mining, and it contributes to a more circular economy.
Right. So it's not just about getting those materials back. It's also about reducing the environmental impact of having to mine them in the first place. Exactly. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
Mining can be incredibly destructive to the environment.
Yeah.
It can have a huge carbon footprint, and it can often lead to social and ethical issues as well.
Right.
So recycling offers a much cleaner and more sustainable alternative.
So let's talk about how that recycling is actually happening and where the technology is headed, because I know there are a lot of advancements in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recycling itself isn't new, but the way that we're recycling EV batteries is changing really rapidly.
Okay.
And it's becoming much more sophisticated in the past. A lot of the focus was on what's called pyrometallurgy.
Pyrometallurgy. Okay.
Which is essentially melting down the entire battery to recover the metals.
Okay, so just like a big furnace, basically.
Kind of, yeah. You melt it all down and then you separate out the different metals. But it's not a very precise process, and you end up with a lot of waste.
Right.
So what we're seeing now is a shift towards hydrometallurgy.
Okay, hydrometallurgy. That sounds a little more
complex.
gentle, maybe.
Yeah, it's a more selective process. So instead of melting the whole thing down, You use chemical solutions to leach out the specific metals that you want.
Oh, okay. So you can actually target the individual element.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that gives you a much higher purity product, and it's much more efficient.
And that's got to be important when we're talking about all these different battery chemistries that are being developed.
Oh, absolutely, because you're not just trying to recover a random mix of metals. You need specific metals in specific quantities to make new batteries.
And you need them to be high quality.
Exactly. And hydrometallurgy is really the key to that.
So are there companies out there that are really leading the way in this sort of advanced recycling technology?
Yeah, there are a number of companies that are doing some really interesting work in this space. One that comes to mind is Altilium. They're an Australian company that's really at the forefront of hydrometallurgical recycling.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, they've developed a process that can recover over 95% of the critical metals from EV batteries, including lithium, nickel, cobalt, and manganese.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And what's really interesting is that they can recover these metals in a form that can be directly used to manufacture new batteries.
Okay.
So you're essentially creating a closed-loop system.
So you're not just throwing it in the recycling bin and hoping for the best. It's actually being reused in a very specific and targeted way.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for the sustainability of the whole EV industry.
So what kind of impact are we talking about here? I mean, how much of the battery material supply could actually come from recycled sources in the future?
Well, the estimates vary, but they're pretty significant. Some projections suggest that recycled materials could account for as much as 10 to 40% of the total supply within the next decade.
Wow.
And for certain metals like cobalt and nickel, we could be looking at over 50% of the supply coming from recycled sources by 2040.
So that's a fundamental shift, right?
It's a complete game changer. I mean, it creates a much more secure and resilient supply chain, especially for countries that don't have their own domestic sources of these materials.
Right, because right now a lot of those materials are coming from just a handful of countries.
Exactly, and that creates a lot of geopolitical risk, and it can lead to price volatility.
Makes sense.
But with recycling, we can start to decouple ourselves from those dependencies and create a more stable and sustainable system.
And I imagine there are some pretty significant cost benefits as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the cost of raw materials is a huge factor in the overall price of EV batteries.
Yeah.
So being able to source those materials more cheaply through recycling could really help to drive down the cost of EVs.
And make them more affordable for consumers.
Exactly. Altilium, for example, estimates that they can produce battery materials from recycled sources at a cost that's about 20% lower than the cost of materials from mine sources.
That's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, and it could be a real game changer in terms of making EVs more competitive with traditional gasoline-powered vehicles.
And it sounds like governments are starting to take notice of this as well, with regulations being put in place to encourage recycling.
Yeah, definitely. Governments are recognizing the importance of this, and they're starting to put policies in place to support the growth of the recycling industry.
Right, like in Europe, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The EU has a new battery regulation that sets some pretty ambitious targets for recycling rates and for the inclusion of recycled content in new batteries.
So they're really trying to create a market for these recycled materials.
Yeah, they're essentially saying to manufacturers, you have to start using recycled materials, and you have to make sure that your batteries are designed for recyclability.
So that sends a pretty strong signal to the industry.
It does, and it's creating a lot of momentum in this space.
Okay, so we've talked about the end of life for these batteries, but let's shift gears now and talk about the batteries themselves.
Okay.
It seems like there's this constant drive to make them better,
Right.
longer range, faster charging, longer lifespan.
Yeah, it's a never-ending quest for the perfect battery.
Right. So what are the main forces that are driving all these changes in battery chemistry?
Well, there are a lot of factors at play here. I mean, from a consumer perspective, people want longer range. They want to be able to drive further on a single charge. And they want to be able to charge their cars quickly.
Right. Who wants to wait, hours and hours to charge their car?
Exactly. So that's pushing the industry towards higher energy density, which essentially means packing more energy into the same amount of space.
Right.
But it's not just about range and charging.
Mm.
There are also concerns about lifespan.
Mm.
People want batteries that will last for the life of the vehicle or even longer.
Right, because replacing a battery can be really expensive.
Exactly. So that's driving research into new materials and designs that can withstand more charge and discharge cycles without degrading.
And then, of course, there's the cost factor.
Always.
So batteries are still one of the most expensive components of an EV. So finding ways to reduce the cost of production is really important.
Absolutely. And then there are also safety considerations.
Mm-hmm.
We need batteries that are reliable and that won't catch fire or explode.
Right, especially as we start to see more and more EVs on the road.
Exactly. And finally, there's a growing awareness of the need to reduce our reliance on certain materials that have environmental or ethical concerns associated with their extraction, like cobalt, for example.
Okay, so a lot of competing priorities to balance.
Yeah, it's a complex equation.
So how are all of these forces actually playing out in the chemistry of these batteries? What are some of the key trends we're seeing?
Well, one of the most significant trends is the move towards higher nickel content in some of the newer battery chemistries.
Okay.
And when we talk about battery chemistry, we're usually talking about these different combinations of metals that make up the cathode, which is one of the key components of a battery.
Okay.
So one common type of chemistry is called NMC, which stands for nickel manganese cobalt.
Okay.
And traditionally, these NMC batteries have had a relatively even distribution of those three metals.
Okay.
But what we're seeing now is a shift towards NMC chemistries with a much higher proportion of nickel, because nickel helps to boost the energy density of the battery.
So more nickel equals longer range.
Basically, yeah. So, for example, you have chemistries like NMC 811 or even higher, where nickel makes up 80% or more of the cathode material.
Wow, so it's really becoming the dominant element.
It is in certain applications, especially where high energy density is really important, like in long-range electric vehicles.
But you mentioned cobalt before as being a problematic material, so is the industry trying to move away from cobalt at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Cobalt has been a real challenge for the battery industry for a few reasons.
Okay.
First of all, it's relatively expensive and the price has been quite volatile.
Yeah.
And second, a lot of the world's cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are serious concerns about human rights abuses and environmental damage associated with mining.
So it's kind of a conflict mineral.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. So there's been a lot of pressure to reduce or eliminate cobalt from EV batteries.
And how are they doing that?
Well, for starters, they're moving away from those older NMC chemistries that had a higher proportion of cobalt.
Like the 1-to-1 ratio.
Exactly. So instead of NMC 111, we're seeing more NMC 622 or A11, where the cobalt content is much lower.
Okay.
And then there are also chemistries like NCA, which stands for nickel, cobalt, aluminum.
Okay.
And NCA batteries can have even lower cobalt content than some NMC batteries.
So it's all about tweaking that recipe to reduce the cobalt.
Yeah, basically. And then there's LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate.
LFP.
Yeah, and LFP batteries don't contain any nickel or cobalt at all.
Okay, so that sounds promising.
It is very promising, and we're seeing LFP batteries being adopted more and more widely, especially for applications where cost is a major factor.
Like in more affordable EVs.
Yeah, exactly. And LFP batteries have some other advantages too, like they're generally very safe and they have a long lifespan.
So it's kind of a win-win.
It can be.
Yeah.
But of course, there's always a trade-off. And in the case of LFP, the main drawback is that it has a lower energy density than some of the high nickel chemistries.
So you might not get as much range out of an LFP battery.
That's right. But for a lot of people, that might not be a deal breaker, especially if the cost savings are significant.
So it's all about finding the right balance for the specific application.
Exactly. That's what it comes down to.
Now, what about some of those more futuristic battery technologies that we hear about, like sodium-ion batteries? Are those a real possibility?
Yeah, sodium-ion batteries are definitely a technology to watch.
Okay.
They're still in the early stages of development, but they have the potential to be a real game changer.
Why is that?
Well, the main reason is that they don't use lithium.
Okay.
Lithium is a key ingredient in most of the batteries that we use today, but it's also a relatively scarce and expensive resource, and the mining of lithium can have some environmental impacts.
Right.
So sodium-ion batteries offer a way to bypass those issues because sodium is incredibly abundant and it's much cheaper than lithium.
So where would we see these sodium-ion batteries being used?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but they could be a good fit for applications where cost is a major consideration or where weight and size are not as important.
Okay, so maybe like stationary energy storage or something like that.
Yeah, possibly. Or they could even be used in some types of electric vehicles, maybe for city driving or short-range applications where you don't need a huge amount of range.
So it's like a horses for courses kind of thing.
Exactly. You choose the right battery for the right job.
And then, of course, there's the holy grail of solid-state batteries.
Ah, yes. Solid salt.
Everyone's talking about them, but they never seem to quite arrive.
They're always just around the corner.
Right. So what's the big deal with solid-state batteries, and what are the challenges in bringing them to market?
Well, the potential of solid-state batteries is really huge.
Okay.
They could offer significantly higher energy density than current lithium-ion batteries, which means longer range for EVs.
Okay, that's a big one.
They're also potentially much safer because they don't use a flammable liquid electrolyte, and they could charge much faster.
So those are some pretty compelling advantages.
They are. But the challenge is that solid-state batteries are really difficult to manufacture at scale and at a cost that's commercially viable.
Okay, so it's a manufacturing challenge more than a scientific challenge.
It's both, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the science is still being worked out too, but even once you have a working solid-state battery, figuring out how to mass produce it cheaply and reliably is a huge hurdle.
So it sounds like it might be a while before we see solid-state batteries in our cars.
It could be a while, yeah. But there are a lot of companies and research institutions working on this problem, so I wouldn't rule them out entirely.
Okay, so we've got all these different chemistries being developed, but one thing they all have in common is that they need to be designed for sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't just keep making batteries without thinking about what happens to them at the end of their life.
Right, so how is that design for sustainability idea actually being implemented?
Well, there are a few key things that need to happen.
Okay.
First of all, we need to make sure that batteries are designed in a way that makes them easy to disassemble and recycle.
Okay, so like modular designs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Using standardized components that can be easily separated and reused. And minimizing the use of adhesives and other materials that make it difficult to take the battery apart.
Right, because I imagine those adhesives can really gum up the works.
They can, yeah. And then another important aspect is labeling.
Labeling.
Yeah, making sure that the different materials in the battery are clearly identified so that recyclers can easily separate them and process them properly.
So it's about making the whole recycling process as efficient as possible.
Exactly. And that requires thinking about the end of life right from the beginning of the design process.
Now, before we actually get to that end of life,
Right.
there's this whole idea of second life applications for EV batteries. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the idea behind Second Life is that even after an EV battery has degraded to the point where it's no longer suitable for use in a vehicle, it still has a lot of useful life left in it.
Okay, so it's not like it just suddenly dies. It just kind of fades away.
Right, exactly. So instead of just recycling those batteries, we can repurpose them for less demanding applications.
Like what?
Well, one of the most promising areas is stationary energy storage.
Okay.
So you could take a battery that's no longer good enough to power a car and use it to store energy from solar panels or wind turbines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that stored energy can then be used to power homes or businesses or even feed back into the electricity grid.
So it's kind of like a distributed energy storage system.
Exactly. And it's a great way to extend the life of these batteries and reduce the overall environmental impact.
And it also helps to reduce the need for brand new stationary storage batteries.
Exactly, which is another win for sustainability.
So it sounds like we're really starting to think about the full life cycle of these batteries in a much more holistic way.
Yeah, we're moving away from this linear model of take, make, and dispose and towards a more circular model where resources are kept in use for as long as possible.
And that's got to be good for everyone.
It is. It's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, and it's good for consumers.
So speaking of consumers, what about the efforts to make these batteries last longer in the first place?
Oh, yeah, that's a huge area of research and development.
Because ultimately, people want batteries that are going to last for the life of their car.
Right. Nobody wants to have to replace their EV battery after just a few years.
Exactly. So what are some of the ways that manufacturers are trying to extend the lifespan of these batteries?
Well, one of the key areas is battery management systems, or BMS.
BMS.
Yeah, and the BMS is basically the brain of the battery, controls how the battery is charged and discharged, and it makes sure that the battery is operating within its safe operating limits.
So it's kind of like a babysitter for the battery?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Yeah.
And as BMS technology has gotten more sophisticated, it's really helped to extend the life of batteries.
Okay.
Another important area is thermal management.
Thermal management.
Yeah, and that's all about keeping the battery at the right temperature because extreme temperatures can really damage a battery.
Right, like if it gets too hot or too cold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So manufacturers are developing all sorts of clever ways to keep batteries cool in hot weather and warm in cold weather.
So they're really pampering these batteries.
They are. They have to, because a happy battery is a long-lived battery.
And then, of course, there are the advancements in the chemistry itself.
Right, and that's where a lot of the really exciting stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Researchers are constantly developing new materials and new designs that can withstand more charge and discharge cycles without degrading.
So we're actually seeing the batteries themselves getting tougher and more resilient.
Exactly. And that's really encouraging because it means that we're moving towards a future where EV batteries can truly last for the life of the vehicle or even longer.
And that's a really big deal because it addresses one of the major concerns that people have about EVs.
It does. And it also opens up some really interesting possibilities for second life applications.
Yeah, because if those batteries are lasting longer, then there are going to be a lot more of them available for repurposing.
Exactly. And that could really accelerate the adoption of stationary energy storage and other second life applications.
Okay, so we've talked about recycling, we've talked about chemistry, we've talked about second life, but there's one more piece of the puzzle that I want to touch on, and that's vehicle to grid, or V2G.
Ah, yes, V2G.
This one always gets me excited because it really shows how EVs can become more than just vehicles.
Yeah, it's a really cool concept.
So can you explain how V2G works?
Sure. So basically the idea is that instead of just drawing power from the grid to charge EVs, we can also use those EVs to send power back to the grid.
Oh, wow. So they become like little mini power plants.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is especially useful during times of peak demand when the grid is under a lot of stress.
So like on a really hot summer day when everyone's running their air conditioners.
Exactly. And instead of having to fire up a bunch of dirty peaker plants, we can just tap into the energy that's stored in all those EV batteries that are plugged in and sitting around.
So it's a much cleaner and more efficient way to manage the grid.
Exactly. And it also creates some really interesting opportunities for EV owners. Well, if you're an EV owner and you're willing to let the grid use your battery to help balance supply and demand,
Yeah.
you can actually get paid for that.
Oh, wow. So you can actually make money by letting the grid use your car battery?
Yeah. It's still early days for V2G, but there are already some pilot programs in place, and it has the potential to be a real win-win for everyone.
So it's good for the grid, it's good for the environment, and it's good for EV owners.
Yeah, and it's a great example of how we can start to think about EVs as part of a larger energy ecosystem.
So it's not just about transportation anymore. It's about how transportation can actually help us to create a cleaner and more sustainable energy system.
Exactly. And that's really exciting.
It is. So to kind of sum up everything we've talked about today, it seems like the future of EV batteries is really about this incredible interplay of factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about developing sustainable and efficient recycling processes. It's about finding the right battery chemistries to meet the diverse needs of different applications. And it's about integrating those batteries into our broader energy infrastructure in a way that benefits everyone.
And it's all happening at an incredible pace.
Yeah. The speed of innovation in this field is really mind-blowing.
It's amazing to watch, and it's only going to accelerate in the years to come.
So ultimately, all of this progress is working towards making electric vehicles a more practical, affordable, and environmentally sound solution for the future of transportation.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
And I think we're well on our way to achieving it.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned a ton.
Me too.
And it really makes you think about the broader implications of all this technology that's being developed.
It does.
I mean, we've talked a lot about cars and energy storage, but who knows what other applications might emerge in the future as these technologies continue to evolve.
That's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
The possibilities are endless.
Yeah, I mean, imagine what we might be able to do with these new batteries in fields like aerospace or robotics or even healthcare.
Yeah, it's really exciting to think about.
So I guess the takeaway is that the future of EV batteries is not just about powering our cars, it's about powering our future.
That's a great way to put it.
And it's a future that's full of possibilities.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today for this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.